Carol, David, and the table are back. David Jolly on being Mike Pence.
Mike Pence is guilty, without question. Mike Pence was told by Trump to skip Zelensky's inauguration in May. Certainly he would have been told why. The phone call happened on July 25th. The text messages occurred throughout August. And on September 1, Donald Trump sends Mike Pence to meet with Ukraine President Zelensky in Warsaw, Poland, for Pence to deliver the message that, Mr. President, you are not receiving your aid. There is no way that Vice President Mike Pence would have gone into that meeting without a full brief of the White House's posture towards Ukraine. He simply would not have. It would have been too dangerous of a national security moment to do so. And the question becomes then, Nicole, if it is impeachable activity for Donald Trump to compromise the national security of the United States by doing this, isn't it also impeachable activity of Mike Pence to further the president's illegal behavior? The House likely won't go that far for reasons of prudence and time, but they certainly could censure him. And when Mike Pence can't answer a question, he is looking like a weak man. Maya Angelou said, courage is the most important virtue of all because without it, you cannot consistently practice other virtues. For a man who likes to profess to honesty, to his religious convictions, he is a weak man, unwilling to accept the truth and unwilling to speak the truth. And it stands in stark contrast to the lieutenant colonel today who is a profile in courage and has been his entire life.
Nicole, I just want to pick up. It's interesting if you kind of say that Pence is going to be tainted by this. And I agree with David. And David, thank you for framing the impeachment as a way national security and nothing about Ukraine.
I learned from you, Donnie. You taught me.
If you work back from Republicans want to stay in power, everything is about the power. And you now say Pence is boy, a Mitt Romney, Nikki Haley ticket would beat any Democrat by a landslide. Just work back from that thought where we end up here. I know I'm I'm way ahead of my skis here, but that's what the Republicans would want to see. And,
does Mitt Romney have to have voted for conviction? I don't think a Republican who hasn't voted to convict this president.
I just really believe that we're heading to some very, very unusual places.
Look, okay. Mike Pence, I think, he's not on the outside looking in. He's at the heart of the scandal, right? And there are two reasons why he doesn't want this. They don't want this transcript to be released. It's basically, did he cross the line and go too far on his own call, right, with Zelensky? Or does it show how widely illegal Trump's call was? I think it's those two things.
Right. If it was different, it makes Trump's conduct even more abnormal. And if it was the same, he's part of the conspiracy. Curly, I don't want the hour to end without getting in your reporting on President Loose Lips. Take us through some of the consternation around the disclosures around that successful raid that resulted in the death of Baghdadi.
Yeah, well, my colleague Courtney Cupey and I talked to current and former military and intelligence officials who kind of walked us through the transcript, basically, of the president's remarks on Sunday morning about the Baghdadi raid and pointed out all of the areas that raised concern for them. And they were many. It was everything from the fact that he disclosed how the special forces entered the compound. They blew a hole in the side of the door. The number of helicopters that were used, how long it took them, how low and fast they flew, all of these details, what the U.S. knew about the compound before going in, which to send signals to adversaries and even allies who like to spy on us about what sort of technologies we have and intelligence gathering capabilities. And so, the overall takeaway was twofold. One is this has been a thing with this president since he came into office. We talked to people who've briefed him who said that they would have to be like, should we put that in the briefing? What if he blurts it out? Do we really want to do that? And then separately on the back end of this, there's just concern that when the president puts forward details like this, that the intelligence community and military officials would rather not have out, it could make the concern is it makes things harder for the next raid, for other operations, including, he mentioned that they had picked up a bunch of materials and and took some prisoners. And the concern there was they weren't ready to release that yet because you don't want that out there. You like to keep what they said was, you want to keep people from the other members of ISIS from knowing precisely what the U.S. has while they're interrogating the people that they picked up. So it's just, an example of the president kind of relishing in these details, finding them fascinating, and disclosing a lot of them because he thinks they're interesting. And he also thinks that things are overclassified, and he's not alone in that. But there were certainly some things in his remarks that were concerning to intelligence and military officials.
Trump's going to do a Giuliani. Giuliani ended up exploiting 9/11 for 20 years. Every New Yorker will tell you that. By the time this story is done, Trump will have rode up on a horse by himself, personally strangled Baghdadi, and single-handedly defeated ISIS. That's the way that story's going to
Detonated the vest himself.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.